In this course section, we are now going to dive into a very popular third-party React library, the Redux library. And we're going to understand what exactly Redux is, why it is so important for the React ecosystem, and how we do use it in React applications. Specifically, we're going to start with the very basics, of course. What is Redux and why would we use it? Then we're going to explore how we use it. So we're going to dive into some Redux basics. And of course, we're also going to learn how we use it in our React project. By then, we'll also know what exactly it does, no worries. And we're going to explore a related library or tool called Redux Toolkit, which simplifies working with Redux, as you will see. Plenty of content to cover. This is an important library, so let's not waste any time and let's dive right in. So what is Redux? Redux is a state management system for a cross-component or app-wide state. So it helps us manage state, data that changes and affects our application and what we display on the screen. It helps us manage such data across multiple components or even the complete app. Now, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, we did, of course, use state a lot in this course already with the use state hook or also with use reducer. And indeed, those hooks exist to allow us to manage data that typically changes, for example, when the user clicks a button, and where changes to that data then typically lead to the UI being updated. We use React's state management hooks like useState so that we can tell React that some data changed and so that it then updates the UI for us. That's what we did throughout this course. And that is what state is all about. But we can split the definition of state into three main kinds of state. We have local state, and we also have cross-component and app-wide state. Now, these are not hard definitions. These are just definitions which you will see a lot, or these are separations of state which you see a lot, and therefore I also like to use them. Now, what is a local state? Local state is state, so data which changes and affects the UI, which belongs to a single component. Now, for example, if we listen to a user input and we use state to store that input with every keystroke in a state variable. Or we have a button that toggles some detail field. So if we click that button, we show the details. If we click it again, we hide them. That would be local state. And typically we manage such local state inside of a component with use state, or if it's more complex, maybe with use reducer. Now, we also often have state that affects not just one component, but multiple components. That would be cross-component state. For example, if we have a button that opens or closes a modal overlay, such a modal component might affect multiple components, and the trigger for opening the modal is per definition not inside of the modal. On the other hand, the modal might be closed by clicking a button which is inside of that modal. So then we have multiple components working together to display and hide a modal. And we can also implement that with use state or use reducer. We then just need to pass props around. So we need to build those prop chains or do this prop drilling, as it's also called, where we pass props across multiple components, where we also might pass functions as props across multiple components so that these different components can work together and manage state together. And that's not bad or anything like that, it's just a little bit more complex than local state. And sometimes we also have state that does not just affect multiple components, but basically all components of an application. Now, when that happens, we could call this app-wide state. And an example here would be user authentication. If I log in, we might need to change the navigation bar because we now show new options. And we also certainly affect a lot of other components which now show more or less data. So that would be an example for app-wide state. And we can also manage this with use state, use reducer, and then by passing state values and updating functions around through props. That's what we did throughout this course, and that of course works. Now for cross-component and app-wide state, passing around data and updating function through props can become cumbersome though. And that's why we did learn about React Context before in the course. React Context is a built-in feature in React that makes managing cross-component or application-wide state easier. So that's one way of simplifying cross-component and app-wide state management. Redux solves the same problem. So both React Context and Redux are there to help us manage such cross-component or app-wide states. And that of course brings up an important question. Why do we need Redux if we already have React Context for managing state that affects multiple components? So Redux is a state management system for cross-component or app-wide state, as we learned. And of course, we can then ask ourselves, but don't we have React Context for that already? React Context is a concept and a feature we already learned about, and which we already used a lot in this course, because it also allows us to avoid prop chains or prop drilling, and instead we can have a central place, our context and the context provider component, which we use for managing state. So why do we need Redux? React Context has a couple of potential disadvantages. And I say potential because they might not matter in the app you're building. And if they don't matter, you don't need Redux. It is as simple as that. And just as a side note, because it's also important, it's also not an either-or decision. You can also use both Context and Redux in the same application. Typically, for application-wide state, you will only use one of the two, but then you could be using Redux for the general application-wide state and still use Context for selected multi-component states which are important in parts of your application. So mixing and matching like that would also be possible. But let's not dive into that right now. Let's instead focus on the disadvantages you could be facing with React Context. But what are these disadvantages then? One potential disadvantage is that with React Context, you can have a very complex setup, and managing state with React Context can become quite complex. And that definitely depends on the kind of application you're building. For a lot of small or medium-sized applications, that will very likely not be a problem. But if you're building a large application, an enterprise-level application with a lot of components and a lot of things going on, then when using React Context, you can end up with code like this, where you have a lot of different pieces of context, a lot of different states that affect multiple components or the entire app, and therefore a lot of different context provider components which you build for managing these states. And you can end up with deeply nested JSX code like this as a result. Of course, you don't need to build a lot of different context providers though. You could just use one big context and one context provider component for managing the entire state and all the different kinds of state of your application. But that could lead in a large context provider component which manages a lot of different things and therefore itself becomes quite difficult to maintain and manage because it's doing a lot of things. You might end up with a large context that cares about authentication, theming, user input, if a modal should be displayed or not, and maybe a lot of other things as well. So that could be a downside. And if you split it into multiple contexts, you might be back to this picture. So that can be a problem. And we haven't faced it thus far in the course because we definitely didn't build a large enterprise level application in this course at this point. But you can absolutely face this problem in real React projects you might be working on. And therefore, this is one potential disadvantage. Another potential disadvantage could be performance. We have an official quote by a member of the React team who basically says that the new context, which is the context you learn about in this course, the post is from 2018, end of 2018, but still that is exactly the context we are using here, that this context, which was introduced back then, which is why the post is from that date, that this context is great for low frequency updates, like changing a theme or maybe also authentication, but it's not that great if your data changes a lot. For high frequency changes, though it's not clear what exactly high frequency means, but for changes that happen more frequently or often in general, that it's not that good for that. And this team member says that, therefore, this new context is not ready as a replacement for Flux-like state propagation. Now, this might not tell you much, but Redux is a Flux-like state management library. So he says that React context is not really a great replacement for Redux in all scenarios, in all cases. So therefore, that's our second disadvantage. Performance can be bad if you're managing the wrong kinds of state with React context. Now, therefore, to sum it up, we have the complex setup and management disadvantage because we may end up with deeply nested JSX code and a lot of different context providers, or with one huge context provider, which is not maintainable. On the other hand, we have potential performance issues because we should not use React context for high-frequency state changes. Now, I will again emphasize that for small or medium-sized apps, and even certainly a lot of big apps, this might all not matter. But of course, my goal with the course here is to teach you realistic React, which you can apply to any kind of project. And therefore, it is important to be aware of these limitations of React context, which could matter in the projects you are working on. And that's exactly why in this module, we are learning about an alternative to React context. We are learning about Redux, which does not suffer from these disadvantages.